Welcome back once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Welcome back once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. I am your host, Josh. It's very lovely to see you all again, figuratively speaking, of course. Today, I'm so excited to bring you a discussion that is very important to the story of Waterloo, and I'm very excited to be talking with Beatrice de Graaf, who is the author of a new book which just came out last year about how Europe secured about the security of Europe after Waterloo, and also she is a professor of the history of international affairs at the University of Utrecht. And if it hadn't been for a glitch in the recording, I said that much better the first time. But I am a great fan, as I just said, for all of you, of Beatrice. And I thought that her podcast with Zach White on the Napoleonicist for Waterloo Remembered last year was an absolutely brilliant piece of analysis.
Well, thank you so very much, Josh, for this generous invitation and introduction. And this is one of the benefits of the lockdown, that you find so many nice, interested people on Twitter historians wanting to discuss these Napoleonic times and the direct aftermath. So very happy to be here.
Indeed. I'm so excited. I've been so excited to talk to you today about this. It's been great to talk to all my internet friends who I've never talked to in person before, most of them, until now. So it is a very strange, positive byproduct of a very disturbing time. I think it behooves me to point out for those watching that there is a very subtle product placement behind your head of your left shoulder, which allows me to plug Jimmy Chen's Napoleonic Impressions website. That is the Wellington manga mug available right now.
I also have the Ney one, but I tend to drink from the Wellington mug.
Well, of course, we all sup from the fountain of Wellington's knowledge, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
So today we're going to be covering a fair amount of ground in this in the time allowed. And we're going to start off by talking about, not talking about the entire Napoleonic Wars, because that's actually an overly ambitious idea, but what happens in 1813, 1814 with the alliance that has been created to bring Napoleon down, and perhaps specifically what is happening in the Netherlands, because that is very key to events in 1815. And the alliance, the Seventh Coalition.
Yes, well, I should say it certainly is, although the Netherlands, it was just one of those theaters of the last post-war days, the last war days. Waterloo, of course, took place on the territory of the Netherlands, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, but it was not the main theater, of course, so we should not overestimate it, although Waterloo was obviously a pivotal battle. The thing is, with the Netherlands, it has been underestimated, so I think it's important to bring it back and to not just discuss Waterloo, but also the role of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands as such, and also the strategies that were developed already in 1814 and then again in March 1815 for the post-war transition, or better put, the transition to a peacetime. And that's what my book is about, because we all know so well, and at least I've been brought up with this in the Netherlands at school and at university, how the Allied powers occupied Germany after the Second World War and how they restored democracy there, how the German Constitution was drafted, and how the Cold War emerged. But for me, it was always quite a strange situation that the Napoleonic Wars, the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, they took 25 years. We know a lot about all the military battles and the theaters of war, and you contributed to that as well, Josh, as did so many others. But how did these wars end, and how did they transition into a situation of collective security? And At one point, I read a book by Norman Neymark, The Russians in Germany, and there's this other book by Ian Burma, 1945. But what exactly happened in 1815? And a couple of years ago, there were a lot of people writing about the Congress of Vienna. And obviously, I studied, and studied again the voluminous book by Paul Schroeder. The major work on the remaking of the international relations in Europe, but still I found out that the details of this transition were missing. Who was there in Europe, in Paris, and how did these allies cooperate with each other, and what was the role of all those different countries and ministers? And that's what I wanted to discover. That's why I wrote this book about it.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I mean, it's not very well understood how security was restored to Europe after 25 years of constant destabilization, politically and of course militarily speaking. And in 1815 is dominated by Waterloo as well. It's like most books about, no, there aren't really books about 1815. There are books about Waterloo, and the end chapter usually says then everybody goes to Paris and then everybody goes back to Vienna, and that's about it. It doesn't really, and there's a lot of myths as well as a result of that. Well, like ages of peace thereafter and things like that, and everybody just gets along, which isn't quite true, but.
There's actually these two myths that emanate out of Waterloo. The one myth is your myth, the dancing and the peacemaking and everyone happy for the next century or so, or at least half a century. And that's the positive myth. And then there's the negative myth. So it was all going back into history, the restoration of the ancient regimes, the repression, and only with the revolutions in 1848 things started to get a little bit more back normal again to the human rights of the French Revolution. I'm completely exaggerating now, I know, but sometimes that helps in finding your own question. And for me, the curiosity was in between. Well, it's part of it is the dancing, part of it is the Congress of Vienna, the concept of Europe. Part of it is the strange situation that it took so long for major world wars to erupt again, at least in Europe, but also around it. But the other part is that how repressive and restorative were these regimes really? I mean, there's a lot of scholarship in the Netherlands on how the Batavian Revolution, as it's called, it's the revolution that came after the French Revolution in the Netherlands, that it was not so much a revolution, it was just a cementation of all the things that were going on already in the Netherlands. We didn't need the French, those new reforms, parliamentary reform were already going on in the Netherlands, so the revolution didn't matter much. Then there's also scholarship that says, well, William I's reign, the Dutch king who was put on the throne by the Allies, he was a Prince of Orange, he was son of the last stadtholder, he came back as a king. I can tell you more about that if you're interested. But people say, well, he was just restorative and was just going back in time. And for me, it was always, this always had some, it didn't sound quite right. Because Michael Broers, he wrote his magnificent works on how the French times changed so much in Europe. And, things changed on the ground in the Netherlands as well. The penal law was introduced, identity, nameplates, streets, etc. The whole way the army, the conscription was organized, the fortresses in the Netherlands were organized. So was it then Napoleon that changed the most? And then was it indeed a rolling back of the situation after 1815? And what happened exactly in 1815? Well, to give one interesting date, today it is the 16th of March. On the 16th of March 1815, that was the moment when William I, who wasn't king until then, proclaimed himself king of the Netherlands. Well, 1813 he came back, he was given the crown, but he only proclaimed himself king on the 16th of March with the support of the Allies in Vienna. And why did he do so? Because just 2 weeks ago, Napoleon had landed on the Golfe de Juan and was marching on to Paris. And William I promised the Allied powers that he would support the 7th Coalition with his share of the troops and that he would put his whole effort and his territory behind this Allied support in rolling back Napoleon once more again. And that's also why he got a blessing from Castlereagh, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the United Kingdom, England. Britain, he got his blessing. also from the Russians and from the Prussians, to crown himself, to name himself king, and proclaim his United Kingdom of the Netherlands, which meant that the Netherlands now were enlarged with Belgium and the Austrian Netherlands, and that it was conceived, designed as a boulevard de l'Europe, a bulwark of Europe. And this was part of the Pitt Plan. It was drafted in 1805 together with the Russian Tsar. Castlereagh revived it in 1815, and in the Netherlands were part of this plan to create a bulwark ranging from the North Sea, Oostende, Oudenaarde, Ath, Antwerp, Brussels, through the German lands onto Italy as a kind of a ring of fortresses, a bulwark against France, to neutralize France. And the Netherlands would be part and parcel of the 7th coalition. So the 16th of March was an important moment, perhaps even more important than the 18th of June, the Battle of Waterloo. But obviously, I mean, the 16th of March and the 18th of June, they belong together, because the son of the Dutch king, he was aide de camp, also a William, who later became King William II. And this Prince Billy, as he was called in Britain, and I think he's called Billy the Frog in Sharp. But Sharp has a very negative rendering of him. Sorry, I'm rambling on. But Sharp is just too negative.
This is good. This is good. I think we should address Mr. Cornwell's depiction of the Prince of Orange, who, historically, Wellington staff affectionately called him Slender Billy.
In the Netherlands also, yeah.
And for some reason, well, no, because they called his father the Old Frog. For some reason, they called him the Young Frog as well. I don't quite understand why. But, I mean, where does it even come from? I mean, the idea...
So frog was used for the French, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't quite understand why the Dutch get this, but it was a thing. The Prince of Orange, obviously, was an aide-de-camp to Wellington in the Peninsular War, and he commanded First Corps of the Allied Army in 1815. This is very controversial. It's a very controversial point. It's almost purely political in a way, because I think objectively Wellington probably wouldn't have appointed him as a fairly junior staff officer in command of so many men if there wasn't a diplomatic purpose because of William I's involvement in the coalition. That being said, the common idea, which was common after Waterloo, that he was an idiot, and obviously the banner was taken up by Bernard Cornwell and Sharp, and there's some ridiculous stuff that happens in that book regarding the Prince of Orange, which is just downright slanderous. It just isn't really true. He wasn't a brilliant commander, but he was an inspiring commander. He was fairly good at organizing things because he was actually in command in Belgium before Wellington got there. I mean, everybody was nervous about that in case he had to fight Napoleon himself. But what do you think about what is still a very popular idea of the Prince of Orange as this sort of incompetent boy?
Well, this is a very interesting topic, and it fascinates me a lot because you still have so different national memories or national perceptions of the main players at the field of Waterloo, ranging from the name of the battle itself, La Belle Alliance, Battle of Waterloo. There are different names in use for this, and there's also a different interpretation of the role of the Prussians versus the role of the Britons, and then the Dutch are mostly seen as outwitted or not to be mentioned at all. We should not again overestimate the role of the Netherlands or the Dutch, neither should we overestimate the role of Slender Billy, and he was indeed an idiot. He was also quite a strange king. He reigned for a couple of years after 1814. He was blackmailed because of his he was most probably was bisexual and was involved in all kinds of scandals and affairs, and he's probably blackmailed into becoming a democratic king overnight in 1848.
Wow.
Which is a very strange story altogether, but that's for another podcast. So there was something to him. He was not completely stable. and that's also something that Wellington saw quite early on. He said, "Well, the king has a good heart, the son of the king. And he is a great warrior. He has courage. He is no coward, but he is quite a loose cannon. He goes off in all kinds of directions, and he needs his directions and his management. And the symbiosis between Wellington and his aide-de-camp was good, and the prince listened to Wellington, and as long as he listened, all went well. And he had also stamina. Constant de Beck, who also figures in Sharp, who wrote, and I recently found this out through my colleague Jeroen van Zanten. I want to mention Jeroen van Zanten because he wrote a brilliant biography on William II, and the quote is from him, and the quote is, the Prince of Orange went to the battle as if he went to a ball. He was calm and collected, and he behaved like an old soldier. Although he was very young, he was only 24 years old, but he behaved like an old soldier. So that's quite a compliment. He didn't lose his cool. He may have made some mistakes. There's even discussion about that, because in the Dutch historiography, it's also said that he hauled off a couple of French regiments, and he was there at the Moment Suprême, and he did contribute to the battle. And he also showed leadership. He was there with his men. And there's also another element, which is, I think you hinted upon that, Josh, quite correctly, the diplomatic aspect. It was not at all self-evident that all these princes and kings and commanders would relinquish control to Wellington, because the Sixth Coalition partly failed because the troops were not aligned completely. And then with the Seventh Coalition, the agreement was made in March. I told you 16 March, proclamation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And then on the 25th of March, and I also want to mention this date and the treaty that was concluded on this day, which was called back then the Treaty of Vienna. So it's not the final act of the Congress of Vienna that was signed in June 1815. It's the 25th of March 1815, Treaty of Vienna for Mutual Security. Also interesting, because the term mutual security was used for the first time in European history. And the important part of this treaty was that all the heads of states and kings promised that they would work together, not just to defeat Napoleon, but they would work together to work until the peace in France was restored. So this went beyond pushing Napoleon back into France. It went on to go into the heart of Paris itself. Don't stop at the border, go to Paris, occupy the country, and also work together to actually sort of execute a regime change and do it together. And the King of the Netherlands at first sort of balked. He didn't want to relinquish his commandership to Wellington because he wanted himself to be supreme commander of the Dutch forces. And then his son, Prince Billy, he did. So he was the one who, and then his father came around as well, and he would have, but it was important diplomatically that Wellington received the support from the Russian Tsar, from the Prussians, but also from the Dutch, and that they really relinquished control to him, and Wellington became the commander of the army in which the Dutch, the Nassauvian, the Belgian, and these were still all different various ethnic regiments and groups, that they were all integrated into this force run by Wellington.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remember that, as well as being commander of the British Army in the field, Wellington was essentially accepted and selected by all the coalition leaders, especially the Tsar, to be one of the principal Allied commanders. And with that backing, he could have a cohesive army, although he complained a lot about it because it was quite a big job to try and organize it the way he liked it, because he was a very particular kind of chap. But
no, and he sent home quite a lot of Dutch and Belgian soldiers. He was complaining about their behavior. They were marauding, they were brutal, and he was completely right about that. So it's not to say that the Dutch was that he should have been very proud or happy with these Dutch troops, but it was diplomatically, and that's the important part of Waterloo and also this treaty of the 25th of March. there's this interesting thing that the Napoleonic Wars are mostly studied from a military perspective, and then later on it's the Congress of Vienna that's studied from a diplomatic perspective. But the military aspect and the international historical aspects and the diplomatic aspects, they're intertwined throughout the Napoleonic Wars, but most precisely and specifically also in these last well, you could say 2 years, from 1813 onwards, from February 1813 onwards, where the Allied forces started their front together in Breslau, Wrocław in Poland. That's where their first Allied headquarters was founded in February 1813. And from that moment onwards, they formed a joint Allied headquarters that was also preparing the occupation for the takeover afterwards. And they didn't know how that would play out or roll out. In 1813, there was still Metternich with his schemes. There was no clarity at all that they would go after Napoleon and cross the Rhine. That decision was only made in November, December 1813 later on. So after the Battle of Leipzig. And then they went back again. And then with Napoleon's return, 1st of March 1815, that really tossed the dice for this huge mutual or collective security approach that came after 1815. And Waterloo was essential for this, because all the troops of the coalition, in as much they were badly and well prepared, they participated in this battle, except for the Russians, which was also important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that is a fascinating instance of sort of power dynamics within the coalition, that prior to 1815, the Russians, because of their great success in 1812 and driving the coalition forwards, were very much central to, were very much one of the, if not the most important part of the coalition, whereas because they have played no military part, meaningful military part in 1815, except for their presence in the field, which was it turned out to be more diplomatic than militarily effective, changed the dynamic a little and allowed Britain and Prussia to have, I guess, more of a say. But what we can say, moving the conversation along, is because that's a whole different discussion.
It's also fascinating, because I think it's not just moving it a little. I think it was a major importance that not Tsar Alexander, as in 1814, entered Paris as the victor, but it was Wellington, and he brought with him British strategy, not Russian strategy. Russian strategy was solve the issue as quick as possibly, go home, take home your troops, and be very lenient and conciliatory towards the French. The Prussians were, of course, completely vengeful, which was understandable for the losses they had led. And then Wellington came in 1815 after Waterloo, and there was a march on Paris. Blucher wanted there to be first, and he was. But in the end, it was Wellington who was asked by all these Allied commanders and princes to preside over the Allied Council that was inaugurated after the military, the Treaty of Military Surrender was concluded in early July 1815, and then Wellington was asked on the 7th of July to take over the chair of this Allied Council, together with Castlereagh. Castlereagh went home later on, but Wellington was in fact not just commander of the joint Allied Army of Occupation, 1.2 million soldiers, can you imagine, occupying a stretch of land, which was almost 25% of the French border territory. It was reduced afterwards, but in the beginning it was that much. And then he took over to remain in France as the commander, not just of the troops, but also the commander or the chairman of this military international political council, which almost operated, I'm now being anachronistic, but it's true, as a kind of a proto-NATO organization, or even because it also dealt with financial and economic issues, almost an EU kind of organization, which is amazing. It completely struck me that it was forgotten. It was never mentioned in all those historical textbooks that it was there.
I know. I mean, it is actually quite new to me, this idea. And it's not mentioned very much at all in biographies, even of Wellington, that he had to take up this mantle either. Most of them talk about his time in Paris after 1815 as a sort of a diplomatic holiday where he's sort of the ambassador. Nothing, I don't really believe, maybe I think Rory Muir is probably the first to go into it more than others, but No, it's not. It's not in Wellington's reputation
No,
that.
from his reputation, this chapter, Wellington as the head of the EU Council, which it was, the Allied Council of Europe, is left out. I think there's several reasons for that, and Rory Muir, he does mention it. But he hasn't looked into the files, and that's one of the main reasons. The files are not bounded in one single volume. There is no series of volumes on the role of the Allied Council in Europe. It's scattered throughout the archives in Europe, and I was lucky to have received the grant from the European Research Council, and had some students and myself as well. It took me 7 years to compile all these sources. So I went to Berlin. Most of the files that I found were in the Prussian archives, and they're written in this awful German Kurrent handwriting. So I knew this. I had learned it at university, but luckily enough, there was an old retired lady who was archivist of the Royal Archives in the Netherlands, who's now in her 80s, and she helped me decipher all these files. I had them on my desk for years, and I have children, and the worst threat that they could be threatened with is don't mess with Mummy's archives. They're on the table and they remain there as long as I need to decipher all these Allied Council writings. Parts of it were in Vienna, in Hauptstaatsarchief, and part of it was in the Netherlands and in France and in London. So it took me quite some puzzling to find them and to stitch them together. They're numbered, so all these meetings, and well, I told you Wellington started, he was asked to do this on the 7th of July. The first meeting of the council was on the 12th of July. Hardenberg was there, Humboldt was there, Blücher was there, Castlereagh and Wellington, of course, then Alexander himself and Metternich, and orbiting around the council was a series of committees that were inaugurated later in July and in August. A committee on the reparation payments, a committee on the occupation, the administrative dimension of the occupation, a committee on the fortresses, a committee on the military affairs. So like the Congress of Vienna, also many more subcommittees there, and they were staffed with secondary ministers, officials, etc. So to Europe was there, and the meetings took place at the Rue de Faubourg, the British embassy. So the Brits were in charge, and this is the main difference between 1814, when Alexander went away quite quickly, and now it was agreed with this Treaty of 25 March. Nay, we will remain here until we have executed this regime change. And one of the first principles that the Allied Council developed was it's again, I don't want to be anachronistic, but it's so much a kind of a pre-runner to the 1945 Allied Council Committee, because they said we want to get rid of the Bonapartists, the Bonapartist ideas. So it's almost a de-Bonapartization, like the denazification. Then we want to demilitarize France. So there was also a committee overseeing the complete overhaul of the French army, not done by the French, but the Allies were presiding over this. And the French army had to be pushed back beyond the Loire, and they could not go back to the north. So, and then there was a special committee founded also by the Allied Council, run by Joseph Gruner, who was the former head of police of Berlin. And this was an Allied intelligence service, and Gruner reported back to Wellington again. So Wellington was also in charge of the intelligence committee of the whole of Europe at that point. It's amazing. But as I said, first of all, these archives were scattered through Europe, and second, if you go back to the textbooks, it's the beginning of the nationalist histories that were described in the 19th century. So the Dutch described their histories, wrote their histories on the making of the great kingdom of the Netherlands. The British wrote their histories on Wellington, etc. The Germans wrote a history about the liberation wars, and the French did not write about it. There's a couple of articles written in the late 19th century, so old historical articles that deal with this situation, but the French leave it out as well. So it's indeed Roy Muir who brought it back, and there is a Dutch book by Nick van Sass in the late 80s who also hinted at this committee. And coming from, as a historian of international relations, I could not imagine that this whole operation because there is a book by Francis Vive on the military army of occupation that's there. So I couldn't conceive of this without any form of control or management or the budget. Who would take care of the budget and divide the funding? So some sort of administrative entity should have been in place. So I went looking for that as a European or an allied undertaking, and then we found it. It was really there, and there was a debate about it as well at the time, because Castlereagh and Wellington took it very seriously, and they got rebukes back home from Bathurst and others who said, well, we do not want to have a council that manages a world council that manages the, how did he say it? The affairs of the world. We do not want to have us rule all the affairs at this council, because then the British would perhaps also be made subject to this council. That's not something that the British government wanted. So there was also a little bit, people were also a bit awkward about this Allied Council, because it didn't quite fit into the nationalist restorations. Of course, it was really something new.
This is all ridiculously fascinating. I think we should. I would like to do another video just about this subject, to be honest. But that it does lead me on to what we started off talking about. What was the plan that they were enacting? Was it inevitable that why did the Bourbons end up back after ostensibly failing and triggering the second Napoleonic resurgence? Essentially, if you can, in the time allowed, how did Europe secure itself for the future? And as you were saying at the beginning, if you want to address the legends of, was it just turning the clock back or not?
This is a very difficult question. There was recently a conference a couple of weeks ago by the Consortium for the Revolutionary Era, and David Armitage was there, and he sat on a panel discussing also this question of the Restoration, about the myth of the Restoration, and he had a great formula for this. I should have known this beforehand, and I would have used it in my book. He said it's a dialectics of revolution and restoration. So it's not just a revolution, it's not just a complete overhaul and the end of the ancient regime, neither is it a complete turning back of the clock after 1815. It's a dialectics, and you cannot write a history of the revolution anymore without a restoration, or restoration without a revolution. And perhaps we should even consider a new name, because the term restoration suggests that you're reverting back. And if anything was new, it was the fact that there were now centralized monarchies. The Kingdom of the Netherlands itself is a novelty. The Netherlands had never been a kingdom. It had never been a central nation state. It only became so after 1815. And the same counts for Prussia. Prussia was not a complete centralized kingdom, and the Napoleonic Wars brought a stream of reforms and liberation movements to the lands of Germany, which also launched a more centralized attempt in Prussia. So things did not revert back to normal. Neither were all the rights or were all the constitutions abolished. In fact, the Congress of Vienna inaugurated more constitutions. And in many countries, including the Netherlands, there were more rights for Jews, for example, ingrained in the constitution, in Switzerland. So it was in Piedmont, in the Italian lands. So it was not just a reverting back. So the organization, the governance, centralized control and command of the armies, for example, conscription, was no turning back of the clock. Then the Bourbons. Obviously, the Bourbons, that felt for many people that it was a reverting back to the ancient medieval times, and Charles X later on, perhaps even more. Even so, the Bourbons were brought back, and because there was no real other alternative present. Things were being discussed, but it was pretty much clear from the beginning, with the king in exile in Ghent after the return of Napoleon, that the Allies would bring him back. Because in order to get rid of Napoleon, get rid of Bonapartism as such, stabilize the country, and get payments for the occupation army and reparations for the war debts, the Allied powers needed a kind of a government that was legitimate in the eyes of the French. And they felt that the Bourbons were perhaps not the best set of cards, but neither were they the worst. And at least the Bourbons, they listened. Louis XVIII, he listened to Wellington. And for example, this idea of putting back the army underneath the border of the Loire, it was very much on the instigation of the Allied powers that Louis XVIII did so. And there's a lot of talk about the Charte, the constitution adopted by Louis XVIII. There again, in 1815, the Allies pressurized him very much, the Bourbon king, behind the curtains, obviously. Wellington was very much the wisp behind the throne, as he had been in India. It's also interesting that the people who came into Paris, Gruner, I mentioned, Richelieu, who would become the prime minister of France after Talleyrand, they had made a career in the colonies, and it's also something of a process of internal colonization, not democratization, but colonization, getting rid of these insurrections, getting rid of the instabilities, and obviously that's in many places, especially in the south, it didn't work at all, and there was an upsurge of white terror. And increasingly the rifts started to erupt again, and that was the reason why the Allied Council did not last until 1820, as the Allied powers had foreseen, but only until 1818, because as Wellington rightfully concluded, he said the reason we're here is because of the stabilization of France, but the longer we stay, the longer we will destabilize France. So a deal was concluded in the end that. And this is one of the most ingenious tricks of the Allied Council with the French government of the Bourbons and Richelieu. It's completely, you almost cannot wrap your head around it. The idea was we go as quickly as we can, as soon as France has paid off its debts. And we will go after February 1818. It was an attack committed on the Duke of Wellington, and in March 1818, the committee said we need to wrap our businesses up, but we want our money back. We want to have the French paid for what they did. How to get these payments? Because the coffers of the treasury were empty. And then Wellington scouted the support of a couple of very influential bankers in Europe, most notably the Baring brothers, also with the Hope, based in Amsterdam. Later on, the Rothschilds, the Laffittes, the Perrier, the French bankers could also join. The bankers from Hamburg and Cologne were also invited. And what they did, they bought off the French debt, and I always find it hard to describe this because I'm not a financial historian, and I worked very hard to work this out, and I described it in detail in my book, so you should read that. But it turned out that in the end, financial securities were used to pay off the European security, for the European security. So the France paid off their debt, and they also, and this is the ingenious part, they also paid for the construction of this barrier of fortresses in the Netherlands, in the German and Italian lands, with their money, in order so they paid for their own preemptive defense network against them. And this is the major trick that and actually it was pretty much Wellington who secured these payments and secured this combination of elements in this security order. Sorry, again, I'm rambling too long, but it's such an intricate and such a complicated and innovative activities that these ministers and these diplomats invented in Paris. And it's really a pity that it has been so it has been lost in oblivion so long.
I agree. I mean, I'm sitting here fascinated by it all because, to be honest with you, this is something I've never heard of before. I mean, like I say, it's hinted at, it's briefly mentioned. There is sort of, you can impute, it's sort of, I don't know what the word is, intuit that something is happening here. It's sort of like, there's a star somewhere because you can see the other planets orbiting it, but you can't see the star. So all of this is really quite new and novel to me, and I really feel like I want to try and do another video with you after I've read more, so I can talk to you more about it, because
No, I'd love to. And of course, I'm very enthusiastic about all this because it's new to me, and it's also so innovative in terms of the new repertoires, the platforms of deliberation that were invented, this tying up of international securities and financial securities, very modern in a fashion as well, and mobilizing. Also interesting, people in France and in the Netherlands and in London and in Germany, they could pay these European obligations. So the people of Europe paid for the European security itself. It would be as if you would bring out NATO obligations on the stocks in London, Amsterdam, and let people pay for their own, lay in and invest in their own security, which was quite an innovative and fascinating method to go with. Obviously, the next question would be, why did it last so briefly? Because it was aborted and terminated in 1818. The Brits went home, and then with Palmer, they were far less oriented towards the continent and towards this European cooperation. And as many people rightfully have stated, the Congress system stops in 1822. Yet, I'm now starting a new project on the 1822s up until the 1830s. A new instrument was invented, and it started with these Allied Council conferences, the Paris Conference, as it was also called. There was a London conference starting in 1816 on the slavery, and there was a new London conference starting in 1830 on the Belgian insurrection, the Belgian independence. And these conferences were pretty much European platforms where the powers of Europe, the concept of Europe, deliberated and also felt entitled to make decisions for the rest of the world. It was very nice in between in Paris with the Allied Council. At some point, the Americans are there. And that's John Adams. He was an ambassador to Russia and in Paris, and then he becomes president, and he wants to be part of this Allied Council as well. And then the four powers plus Richelieu, who was also invited to sit in at some point, they said, well, no, the Americans, they don't belong to the concept of Europe. We run the affairs of the world, not the Americans. So they sort of exclude the Americans, which is quite funny. They could have accepted them back then. So it makes for an iffy history.
Yes, that's brilliant. That's very funny. But yeah, so I think I now have to go away and read up on some stuff here, and we should do another video where we talk specifically about more stuff about this, and I'll have lots more questions for you and things. But I think we are now at the end of our time.
I'm sorry, I talk too much about it because I'm still too enthusiastic about it.
My goodness, this is a lane of conversation which is very surprising and very welcome, to be honest. It's an excellent subject, and I'm very happy that it came up. I mean, it's not entirely divorced from the original idea of what we wanted to talk about anyway, either, because it is a long.
Entirely. That's very generous of you, Josh. Yeah.
I don't think it is entirely divorced at all, to be honest. I think this is actually key to the concept of what happens after Waterloo, and it needs to be better understood in the fact that, I mean, it's only recently now that anybody really starts to care about what happens after Waterloo anyway, and it's really nice to look at it from an international point of view as well. There's nothing more boring in a way than those nationalist histories that sort of became common after during. Yeah.
Sorry, so very briefly, I'm very happy that you make that statement, George, because I feel that the commanders and the generals of that time were not completely nationalistic either. They were very much tuned into this concept of Europe idea because they knew, at least in 1815 with Waterloo, they knew that they needed each other. They needed to work together to prevent any of this happening ever again. So for Wellington, but also Czartoryski, the Polish advisor to Tsar Alexander early on, the Humboldts, the Hardenbergs, also Richelieu, even Talleyrand briefly, they all were very much aware of the importance and the necessity of doing it in tandem internationally. So this idea that the powers of Europe, the empires, that they clash, and that this is the starting point for competition and imperialist rivalries, that's true as well. I'm not wanting to paint a rosy-eyed or starry-eyed revision of history, but there's also this cooperation. And this is also something that we should bring up perhaps later on. This cooperation was not only beneficial, because it was, of course, for many people, minorities, also very repressive. For the Ottoman Empire, for the Corsairs, for the warlords in Northern Africa. So it was also, it unleashed a pan-European cooperation, which became inter-imperialist cooperation, to the detriment of many other people as well. So I wanted to make that statement too, not to say that it's only positive what happened here, but it's important to accept the fact that the contemporaries of that time were far more internationally cosmopolitic oriented, and it's also something like a conservative cosmopolitanism. Matthijs Lok wrote about this, and I think that's also what was going on here. Not just the Holy Alliance, not that simplistic myth, but something more sophisticated than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Again, absolutely fascinating approach to looking at what happened after Waterloo and the effects of it. So we are going to. I would very much appreciate talking to you again about this. But for now, obviously we've run out of time. There are some things that we want to do for the rest of the day. I actually have another recording at 5. And with Zach, actually, so I'll pass on your regards to him. And
thank you.
I'm very excited about all that has just been talked about here. I really want to now go and if you're willing to do another video at some point about it.
Most happy. As you can see, I cannot stop. Again, it's exciting history.
Excellent, absolutely exciting. And just that little wrap-up bit at the end. I would talk about that for the rest of the day as well. But anyway, thank you, everybody, for watching. There will, I promise, be more with myself and Beatrice in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us what you think about it. If you have any questions, I will pass your questions on to Beatrice if you have anything specific, and we'll try and get them answered for you. Until then, as I like to encourage people at the end of these videos, first of all, thanking Beatrice for being such an excellent guest, and for being a constant source of inspiration on Twitter and in what she does online. Have courage and have compassion, and Godspeed, and I will see you again in the next video.
Thank you so much, Josh.